I want to start from the title of the book, the new book that is published in Italy by Fazzi, and about a word that is conflict. Why you talk about conflict? Because you spoke about very different words, but why you choosing this very brief history of the conflict, the word conflict?
Yeah, it's a very good point you're making, because of another book of mine which appeared in Italian with Noam Chomsky. We question the term conflict for describing what's happening between Israel and Palestine. However, the idea for this book came from readers who said we know nothing about the history. And we thought you cannot give them a title that totally confuses them. I hope that by the time they finish the book, and on purpose I wrote a short book, they would understand that actually the term conflict is not totally appropriate here. I'm doing a similar thing in my university, where I teach a course on the conflict, and in the first lecture I say to them, this is the wrong title, but you would not have come to the class if I didn't put the term conflict. So it's part of this navigation that we do, I think, between the language that most mainstream media and academia use and the language that we would like to use that challenges the mainstream language. But you're absolutely right. Uh, uh, this is not for me the right term, but it's a common term.
Why you spoke about one particular kind of colonialism?
Yeah, definitely. There is a difference between what one can call classical colonialism and settler colonialism. Classical colonialism are colonies built by empires who send their own people to colonize outside of Europe. And when the empire ends or disintegrates, collapses, the colonists go back to the empire. So the British in India would go back to Britain. Settler colonialism is a different historical phenomenon. These are Europeans who were, in many ways, either expelled from Europe or had to leave Europe for economic, cultural, political reasons. They wanted to stay in Europe. They didn't want to leave Europe, but they had to. And they settle with the help of the empires in outside of Europe and try to create the Europe there, the Europe that didn't want them. They wanted to create there. They are different from the empire for two reasons. One, as history would show, they don't want to be part of the empire. They create their own nationalism. That's one difference. And that's how the United States, Canada, and many other countries were born. And unlike the classical colonialists who want to exploit the native people in the countries which became colonies, the settlers want to get rid of the native people, to eliminate them. So it's a very different kind of phenomenon. It also means that 2 generations later, you cannot say that these settlers have a home country to go to, because they believe that they belong to the new land. So it's a very violent project towards the native people, but it's a saving project or salvage project for those who were kicked out of Europe.
I want to start from the beginning of this book. And going back in time, you explain how the conflict became insoluble. And you wrote that the devastation of 7 October and the horrors that followed astonished the world. But the Israel-Palestine conflict didn't start on 7 October. It didn't start in 1967 either. It didn't start in 1948. But it started in 1882 when the first Zionist settlers arrived in what then was Ottoman Palestine. What happened in that time?
Yeah. In 1882, Jewish activists from Eastern Europe who believed that the only solution for anti-Semitism was to connect to the idea of colonialism by colonizing Palestine, which they believed belonged to the Jewish people because of the Bible, which in brackets, which you say was very weird because they were not very religious themselves. But nonetheless, they used the Bible to justify it. They also wanted to see Judaism as nationalism. And they arrived in Palestine after they ruled out other options. And of course, the first wave was not violent. They came poor, had to learn from the local Arabs how to cultivate the land. In fact, the local Arabs assisted them when they arrived because they were very poor. But they already, not physically, but mentally, in their imagination, they already began to perceive how to get rid of the Arabs. I once wrote an article in which I looked at the early letters and diaries of these early Zionists who came to Palestine. And they already talk about the Palestinians who hosted them as aliens, as people who do not belong to Palestine, actually people who took over illegally Palestine from the Jewish people. And you can already see that they are imagining a Palestine without the Palestinians. So it's violent, not physically, but it's violent symbolically. Of course, later on, when they would have the capacity to translate the imagination into reality, it would become violent. So for me, the conflict sometimes, or bloodshed or violence, also I think in personal life, can begin in your mind. It doesn't necessarily begin with your body. It can begin with your mind, with your imagination. Of course, most people do not always move from imagination to practice, but political movements do, I think. They never stay in the minds of people.
Has never been separated from the Arab world. Is it an integral part? And it has never been a land without a people. And why is it important and so difficult to make it clear?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This is a myth that the Zionist movement developed, and later the State of Israel continued, and still is part of the Israeli Zionist narrative. That Palestine was terra nulla. It was an empty land with no people in it. Although the historical research, academics, historians, Palestinians and non-Palestinians have already shown that this is a lie, it's a fabrication, it's still very much accepted by a lot of people. I think the reason is that it makes it easier to support Israel, to think that the Zionist movement did not build a Jewish state on the ruins of Palestine. That actually was empty. But it doesn't work. The most interesting thing about it is that, like all mythologies of national and settler colonial movements, they have internal contradictions which they cannot solve. Because if the land was empty, who are the Arabs that fought against Israel, right? I mean, this does not, you cannot reconcile the two ideas, but yeah, definitely. And I think the other part for me is even more important, because I think the empty land is now a bit passé because so much time has passed since. But the other one is for me more important for nowadays, the organic connection between Palestine and the Arab world. It's very, very important, because the one thing Israel wanted to build is an image of a European country that by accident is not in Europe, but should be in Europe, physically, geographically. So they go to the Eurovision, they go to play European football. They would like to see themselves as a European country. And that is one way of alienating the Arab world around them. instead of accepting that, okay, you want to be part of this region, fine, but you cannot be an alien in the region. You have to accept it. So I think that is very important to remind people that Palestine was easily connected. In fact, Jews who are still alive from the mandatory period, which is between 1918 to 1948, not many still alive, but those who are still alive, definitely, I remember my parents telling me this. They know that you could take the train from Haifa to Beirut, from Haifa to Cairo or Alexandria or to Damascus, that important singers and theater from Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria came to perform in Jaffa, Haifa, in Jerusalem. So it was, I think 1948, it was still much more part of the Arab world than Europe. Israel, after 48, tried to extract it from the Arab world.
About this relationship with Europe, Europe that the first to consider the Jews as members of a nation or a race and not of a religion were the evangelical Christians, partly because they were convinced that with the return of the Jews to the promised land, the end of the world will be accelerated. Partly because in this way they wanted to wrest the Holy Land from the hands of the Muslims, like you said before. Are those current Christian fundamentalists who still represent the most important pro-Israel lobby in the United States still convinced of this thought?
Oh yes, if you listen to, if you drive with your car in the American Midwest, what is called the Bible Belt, it's called, this American states where Christian fundamentalism is very prevalent and very popular, and you open your radio, you can hear these kinds of sermons and ideas aired through the radio to the faithful. And similarly, if you go to the the tele preachers, those preachers who are having their own TV stations sometimes, definitely they have their own TV programs. That's the way that they still talk today, namely this idea that supporting Israel today, and in those days supporting the settlement of the Jews in Palestine. Now it's supporting the state of Israel, but it's the same idea. Is an assured recipe for the return of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the beginning of the reign of 1,000 years of Christ upon earth. They have different versions of it, but the basic idea is that it's a religious imperative to support Israel if you believe that one day the Messiah will come back, and with it the doomsday kind of scenario would unfold. So yeah, I think this is, and I wrote that they are probably today the most important pillar of the pro-Israeli lobby in America, because the Jewish one is weakening. We may talk about it a bit later, maybe, but the younger Jewish generation is not Zionist anymore. And the military industry in America is not sure anymore that Israel is such a big deal. So you're left with the faithful, the Christian Zionists, who believe it's a religious duty to support Israel because of its place in the this end of time scenario.
I want to ask you, what kind of pressure did the Zionist movement put on the British government regarding the private property conventions in place under the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, that is very important, because the Zionist movement until 1948, when it was able to use force to replace the Palestinians with Jewish immigrants and displace the Palestinians. Before they could do it in 1948, the main method was to buy land, to purchase land. The problem for them was that according to the Ottoman practice and law, you could buy land from a landowner, and these were huge lands, not small parcels of land. But you were supposed to let everyone who lived on the land to continue to live on it. So what you had in Palestine, you had landlords, many of them not Palestinians, not living in Palestine, who owned large swaths of lands. And on that land, there were usually 10 or 15 villages. And since the mid 19th century, the Ottoman Empire for the first time allowed people to transact with the land. So you could make money out of it. You could buy the land and sell it to someone else. Now, when these people sold the land to new landowners, for the people in the villages, it didn't matter. It was a different landowner, but it did not affect them, apart from paying taxes to someone else. The Zionist movement did not like this system because they wanted the land, but didn't want the villages on the land. So it put pressure on the British government to change after Britain occupied Palestine and accepted a mandate over Palestine from the League of Nations from 1918 onwards. They put pressure on the British government to use the European land law. Namely, if I buy your house or your land, it's mine. No, and I can do whatever I want on this. And if there are tenants on your land, I can throw them out. I can evict them. And they succeeded convincing the British that the Ottoman custom is not relevant anymore. And the British police was willing to come and throw out the villagers that were on the land that the Zionists bought. Now, the first time it happened was in 1926, because until 1926, the Zionist movement bought land without any villages on it. But that land was not very good, not very fertile. And anyway, it was not enough. So that's when they decide to try and buy land which already has villages on it, only after they are convinced that the British government would cooperate and evict. So, but in the 1920s, about 11 Palestinian villages were evicted in such a way. So it was I call it the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Of course, the big wave would come in 1948.
From the beginning, from Herzi onwards, the intention was to make the Palestinians disappear as a penniless population beyond the border.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a dehumanizing and a classist issue at the root?
Yeah. Well, I think all settler colonial movement, and Zionism is not an exception, have to dehumanize the native population. Because the native population is seen as the main obstacle for the success of the settler colonial project. You cannot treat them as humans, because if you treat them as humans, you might find it difficult to displace them or eliminate them. So yeah, definitely you and again, as we talked before, the dehumanization has to start in the mind, in the writing, in the poetry, in drawings, and so on, before it is translated into actual policy on the ground. So yes, you find it first in Herzl's diary, the quote that you brought, and then you read the first essays written by the early ideological fathers of Zionism, and they repeat this dehumanization. And this is before even one Palestinian is being driven out of the land.
And this past also thinking that a population doesn't have a literature or a poetry.
Absolutely. This is where the term savage was used both by Zionist settlers and American settlers, as you know. It was totally degrading the culture of the indigenous population. But as good scholars of settler colonialism commented, you appropriate that culture. On the one hand, you say it's not culture, but you take it over. You at least you take over the way people dress, the way they eat, folklore, and so on. So yeah, but definitely, and this stays on with the Israelis for many many years. I remember a famous conversation on television between the late Edward Said and late Amos Oz. Someone was trying to bring them together, and Said asked Amos Oz, "Do you know a name, one name, of an Arab writer or a Palestinian writer, Palestinian philosopher, an Arab philosopher, so on?" He didn't know one name. And he said to him, "You see, that the reason you don't know him, not that they're not important and famous, we know them all, but this is the way you treat our." So it's not just Palestinian culture; it's Arab culture in general. Yeah.
About this, what makes does dispel the existence of the Palestinian Arab Congress founded in 1990?
One of the important myths that is connected to dehumanization, the degrading of culture, is that, of course, the Palestinians were not a nation. And there was no Palestinian national movement. There were just a bunch of Bedouins, nomad Arabs, and so on. And I think this Congress that was made of political parties that elected the representative to a national Congress that met once a year from 1919 until 1929 shows that there was a proper Palestinian national movement in name, in organization. It had its own newspapers, own intellectuals, political ideologues, and so on. So Zionism came to Palestine when Palestine, like the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, was undergoing a process of national identity, of developing national identity. This is very important because it allows also Palestinians to imagine what would have happened to Palestine had the Zionist movement not choose it as its destination. Um, so probably Palestine, like Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, would have developed in a similar, maybe even a better way. But yeah, so I think that's very crucial to understand that there was a culture, there was a national identity, and there were proper human beings, not subhumans. Yeah.
How did the British Protectorate contribute to the strengthening of Jewish settlers and the colonization of the Palestinians? Uh, you wrote about an infrastructural, an educational, and also a military point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. The British decided from very early on to treat differently the Palestinian majority of the land and the Jewish settlers minority. The Palestinians were treated as if they were typical colonized people. Everything has to be monitored, supervised, and taken care of. They accepted that the Jewish settlers were a different category. So they gave them a lot of autonomy because they were loyal to the Balfour Declaration that in which Britain promised the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration was incorporated in the Mandate Charter. So, according to that, the British felt obliged to treat the Jewish community as a state within a state, allowing it with the idea that in the future the Jews would have their own state in Palestine. So they were allowed autonomy in education, health, and most importantly, in the army, military. Whereas all these kind of infrastructures were denied to the Palestinians. And so there was an imbalance and a discrimination here that helped the Zionist movement to build an infrastructure for a state in the future.
one word hurt me is the land is not empty. It is the settlers who empty it.
Yes, yes, it is because one of the myths that was actually repeated in 2018 by the German president of the EU. She said she congratulated Israel for blooming the desert, if you remember. And that means that in this imagination, Palestine was a desert, an empty land. And the Zionist movement made it a paradise. And history shows exactly the opposite. There was a paradise called Palestine. It was blooming. It had water. It had fertile land. And the Zionist movement took over the land, took over the water, destroyed the villages. And in many, the Palestinian parts became a desert rather than the desert becoming a paradise. And so I think it's very important to understand that the myth is terrible because it does two things. It describes Palestine as a desert. Yes, part of Palestine is a desert, but most of it is not. And it describes the Zionists as people who came and with a miracle turned a very primitive place into a paradise. But in fact, they destroyed a community that was thriving in a country that ecologically had a lot to offer, which we don't have it anymore in Palestine. There were fresh water everywhere. There were fertile grounds. All this has gone. Of course, in some parts, the Zionists were able to revitalize the agriculture, but this is after they have destroyed it, not because it wasn't there.
How is possible that a lot of Israelis still believe that they were the one who made it as a bloom?
Well, Israel is a very indoctrinated society, and even the pre-1948 Jewish community was very indoctrinized. Indoctrination means that you are exposed to these ideas from a very early age. You hear it in your kindergarten, in school. The army plays a very important role in socialization, and the media collaborates with it. So they are exposed all the time to this mythology and believe that this is true. And even if those who try to challenge it, they are treated as not as people who bring some news that nobody knew about. They're treated as traitors. It's a very, it's both a very indoctrinated society, but also very patriotic. And so it doesn't allow people to question the basic truisms of Zionism.
1936, the British Army set itself the goal on not only suppressing the revolt, but ensuring that the Palestinians could no longer revolt. And there has often been a similar attitude through his history, the history of Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an interesting correlation between the way the British Empire treated the Palestinian national movement and the way the Israelis are treating the national movement. Some of the methods the British used were copied by Israel later on. For instance, collective punishment, killing of the leaders of, believing that if you kill the leaders of the movement, you kill the movement itself, because of this Orientalist idea that in societies like the Arab societies, the most important person is the leader. They didn't think of in European ways, like maybe the most important thing is the ideology, not the person. And you cannot kill an ideology. But yeah. So I think there is this similarity. Yeah, it's the same thing. The Zionist movement didn't have the power to kill Palestinian leaders before 1946. I mentioned, I'm sure I mentioned in this book or another book of mine, probably in this one, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. In 1946, the Zionist command had something called Plan C, Plan Gimel, and in that plan, it was 1946, it was decided to try and assassinate Palestinian political leaders with the hope that it will make it easier after they are removed to take over Palestine once the British would leave it. So you already had this idea. It was called the Sparrow, little bird, the Sparrow Plan. And this was the first time they thought in such a way. Afterwards, it was resurfaced after the PLO came into being, when they began to think that killing leaders of the Palestinian resistance would tame the resistance or even abolish it, which of course never happened. Never happened. But they still continue. This morning they killed the three leaders of the Popular Front, the Palestinian Popular Front in North Beirut. Not in the Shia areas, in the Sunni areas. Why they killed the leftists in the Palestinian national movement? I think that they don't even think anymore. They just anywhere they see a Palestinian leader, they think they should kill them.
You wrote that there were three simultaneous processes that then led to the Nakba, the failure of the diplomatic efforts, the inadequacy of the attempts of the Arab world, and the preparation for the ethnic cleansing.
That's right.
It is striking that in the end that the diplomatic efforts failed, you're right, because no one was able to give a justification for why Palestine was treated as an exceptional case. And the UN, by recommending the creation of Israel, of the Jewish state, was paving the way for the catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely, because there were, even in the United Nations, and definitely in the American State Department, people who understood that the only way to deal with the new reality that the Zionist movement created in Palestine, the only way that could stop a violent clash was to persuade the Zionists that they are a minority that can stay in Palestine, but Palestine would be, or the future of Palestine, would be determined by the Arab majority, according to the principle of democracy and the principle of self-determination, like anywhere else in the new world that was built after the Second World War. The United Nations eventually, and also the United States, and one should say also the Soviet Union, decided against this idea. And they said, no, we have to impose on the Palestinians the idea that half of the country belongs to the settlers now. There's no way any people in the world would have accepted it. If you told the Algerians that they have to give half of Algeria to the French settlers, they would have rejected it on the spot. Not one indigenous native people in the world thought that settlers deserve to have half of their country. And somehow in the United Nations they knew it, but I think they hoped that they had this Orientalist idea that the Palestinians are the most, kind of not totally developed. Maybe they can be bribed. Maybe they can be convinced that this is better for them. Of course, nothing of that happened. I'm not sure how much did the United Nations know, unlike what Walid Khalidi writes, that the Jewish national movement would not be satisfied with half of Palestine, and definitely will not be satisfied with the fact that in that half, already half of the population were Arabs. Namely, I don't know if the United Nations or the US knew that the Zionist movement was preparing an ethnic cleansing operation. But I think even if they would have, I'm guessing here, that even if they would have known it, I don't think they would still have gone with the petition, because there was no real interest in the Palestinians. And we have to remember, I'm not sure I'm saying this in this book, I hope I do, the West was thinking about the Holocaust all the time. And even if you would have convinced, an American president, Truman, or the British Prime Minister, said to them, the moment you'll have the partition, the Jewish forces will expel the Palestinians. I have a feeling that they would have said something like, this is a small injustice to correct a bigger injustice, namely the Holocaust in Europe. That really worked against the Palestinians. So even those in the West who understood that actually partition is not a solution and is actually an introduction to something much worse for the Palestinians, not for the Jews, would have said, yes, but that's the best way to close, because the genocide of the Jews was very much in the back of the mind of these Western politicians.
Like you said before, the Gaza Strip, the world's largest refugees camp, was created to house Palestinians expelled from Israel. But Gaza was once a cosmopolitan city.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there wasn't just beautiful places and water, but there was also a community that was broken. And what could we do today to try to create this consciousness about people who think that Gaza was always this, and we have to thanks to the one who created this refugee camp.
Yes, I think what we need to do, and that's not easy, is to convince people that they have to study history. I'm not saying that they have to go to the university to study history. I mean that they have to read about history. Historians have here a very important role, I think, because it's only through a patient reconstruction of history that you can see how things developed and how Gaza, from being a normal town on Via Maris, the road from Egypt to Turkey, with so many cultures going on it, a Jewish, Christian, Muslim community living together in that place, was turned in 2 weeks into the biggest refugee camp in the world. You need the historians to show with documents and evidence that there was a different Gaza, and to reconstruct the transformation. How did it happen? What happened? And it's not easy, because in this age with TikTok, Instagram, and so on, you cannot do it with one sentence or soundbite. You need people to be patient, to listen to, at least to listen to a lecture of half an hour or read a book. But it's very difficult, because this kind of explanation is not adapted very well, does not adapt very well to the way information is nowadays conveyed to people.
This brings to mind me that you wrote that Judaization is based on the perpetual subordination of the Palestinians.
Yeah, because the basic idea is to have a Jewish state over historical Palestine as an idea. And that contradicts the reality where most of the people are not Jewish. You need to reconcile this contradiction. And the only way you can reconcile it is by force, by oppression. Now, to oppress millions of people is a big job. And to make sure that these people do not revolt, do not challenge you, you have to all the time subordinate them, as I call it. And I don't think how many people in Italy, for instance, are aware how many people you have to employ in order to subordinate another people. Now for more than 76 years, or definitely for 57 years when we talk about, the West Bank. hundreds of thousands of Israelis are employed in order to make sure that the Palestinians don't resist. And even that doesn't work. As we know, we had the first intifada, we had the second intifada. I think we are now witnessing a third intifada. That's the context for what the Hamas did on the 7th of October. Probably what the Hamas did is starting a third intifada. We are still in it, so we don't understand it. But we are in the third intifada now. And it will continue as long as the Palestinians are oppressed. Some Israelis believe they have now the power to get rid of all the Palestinians, which is ridiculous, but they do believe in it. But yeah, that's what it's a very abnormal reality, not just for the Palestinians, but also for the Jewish people.
And what could happen in the third intifada differently from the first and the second?
It's a moment of truth. There won't be a fourth intifada. This is now. This is now the end game. And that's why it can go on for a very long time. You know, the first and second intifada were not long. I mean, they were long. The first intifada was, there were 2 or 3 years altogether. But I'm talking here something much longer. Much longer. But it will, to my mind, end Israel. It will bring the end of Israel. But it will take time. And of course, I'm not determinist. You can change it. It depends on people. If they want to have a proper solution, they can avert it. If the international community would interfere, it can be a different scenario. But if what we see today, for instance, that the United States is not doing anything, there is no one else who challenges the Americans actually as the main power in the area. It can be a very long collapse of Israel into a long period of fighting with Palestinians, friends of the Palestinians. You have to remember, around Israel, there are millions of people who are hungry, angry, and if there will be more democracy, ironically, with more democracy in places such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, there will be more solidarity with the Palestinians. It will be even more difficult for Israel to resist. There's a way out of it. I believe that the moment the Jews, well, I can't see it happening now, the moment the Jews would accept that they are in the Arab world, that Palestine is an Arab state, and they can have a special status in it, the moment they will realize it, there is a chance for a more peaceful future. But right now, it's not going in that direction, unfortunately.
About this come to my mind the opening of the book that has an examination of the crisis that is confronting Israel today, threats that strike at the very heart of the state's cohesion. And you talk about 4 points. The first is the implosion of the Israeli Jewish society. The second is the nation's descent into pariah status, like you're telling now. And the third is the growing disenchantment of young Jews worldwide, like you tell us before. And the fourth, I want to ask you for more. You talk about the stark revelation that the Israeli military has failed to safeguard civilians, as it had long promised, and the fact that the government doesn't work well anymore. But more, I want to ask you about the last thing that you talk, that is the fifth, more or less, and you talk about the new generation of Palestinians, and you talk about the new generation that is emerging and that will ultimately shape the future of the country. What could happen to this young generation?
So first of all, it's important to realize that the Palestinian society is one of the youngest in the world. 50% of the Palestinians, wherever they are below 18. So it's a very young generation. And secondly, because of the age of internet, we know more about what they think and how they interact, because they use the cyberspace for that. And unlike the current generation of Palestinian politicians and leaders, you can see the difference, a very stark difference between the current people who pretend to be the leaders of the Palestinians and the young ones. First of all, they are far more united. They are not divided into Hamas, Fatah, into political faction. There's hardly any factionalism among the young people. Secondly, they have a very different vision of a free Palestine, a one-state solution, one can call it, a democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. And they are far more connected, despite the physical separation that Israel imposed on the Palestinians. So people in Haifa talk to people in Ramallah, who talk to people in Beirut, who talk to people in Detroit, and so on. So you have a generation that is dealing better with the most important weakness of the Palestinian national movement, which is disunity. But they're still lacking organization. They don't have any organization, which is terrible. We saw the same thing in the Arab Spring. There is a young, one can understand it. There is a disdain. There is a rejection of organization because they believe organization lead to dictatorship, to corruption. But I don't think you can translate your power without trade unions, parties, organization, leadership. I don't know how they're going to solve it because I think they begin to realize that just being right and just is not enough. You need to be very well organized. And they're not. They're not. But I think once they will be, and I hope they will be, I think they will change the game because if the world would be convinced that the main Palestinian demand is to have equality, equal rights for Jews and Arabs in a proper democratic state, not partition, not autonomy, no Bantustan, a post-apartheid Palestine, if you want. The world might adopt it also as an international assignment. Because right now the world says, the Palestinian leaders say they want a two-state solution. What do you want from us? We cannot say something the Palestinians don't want. So it's very difficult to move ahead because there's no chance for a two-state solution. It's already dead. So I'm optimistic about this young generation. I just think it will take them a lot of time before they will make an impact.
About the secular Jews in Israel, you wrote that they were unbothered by the oppression of Palestinians, but they have become alarmed by the potential repercussions of the theocratization of the state on LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah.
They didn't protest for the apartheid. How is possible this double standard?
Well, it's possible. We saw it in apartheid South Africa as well. You somehow you live in a bubble, and you either choose not to see what everybody can see, or you see and you find a way of telling yourself, well, it's not my problem. Tel Aviv is 10 kilometers or something like this from Gaza. And Gaza was a ghetto, a big prison. And people in Tel Aviv didn't care. They went on with their great life and so on. So that's one side of it. One side of it is that you cannot pretend that what matters is your liberal progressive life if that is done in a place where so much criminality is happening around it. You are, even if you don't feel responsible, you are responsible. But it's very difficult for people to accept it. But in many ways, the big festival on the 7th of October was such a thing. I mean, there was a huge, nothing justifies what happened to them for sure. But there was a huge festival a few meters from the ghetto. This is incredible if you think about it. The second part is interesting, is that the messianic Zionists who are now controlling Israeli politics used to be very marginal, but now they are the most important force in Israel. See see the secular Jews also as a problem, not just the Arabs. They have a special term for the secular Jews, which is called the donkey's the donkey of the Messiah. The seculars are the donkey, namely they carry the Messiah, which was an important historical mission, but now the Messiah has arrived. There's no need for the donkey, and the secular Jews have two options: either they would become religious and accept the theocracy, or they would be treated like Arabs. And that is something that the secular Jews suddenly realized, that their enemies are not just the Palestinians, that their enemies are these Jews. And this has led to something which you can call kind of a cold civil war between the secular and the religious Jews. That was stopped for a while because of the 7th of October, but it's coming back.
And is this connected in some way to the affirmation that I found in your book that is about the left in Israel? There isn't anymore. There is no real left in Israel.
They cannot, Albert Mami wrote about the leftist colonizer. And he said that he thought this was a possibility, but he criticized it, right? And you have a person who has universal values of socialism on the one hand, but is not totally opposed to the colonization of North Africa by the French. And somehow hopes that the universal values make the colonization better, easier, more humane, more progressive. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And that is the main problem of the Israeli left. It was trying to be universal and still loyal to the settler colonial project. And the Israeli electorate maybe rightly said, no, either we are colonizers or we are not colonizers, but you cannot be both. And that's why I think the Israelis are voting for the right wing for many, many years now. So the Zionist left is gone. There is a proper left in Israel, in the civil society, an anti-Zionist left, but it's very small. But that's the real left that is still there. But what we used to call the Zionist left, which used to be a very important political power in Israel, has totally disappeared.
One thug's question: how can one defend oneself from those who use the accusation of anti-Semitism as a weapon in the face of detailed criticism?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because it's not easy to be condemned as an anti-Semite. I think the only way of doing it is to demand space and time from the people who make the accusation. In other words, you cannot answer the accusation by a soundbite, by a slogan. You really need to sit with these people who say this and take some of the time, if they're willing to give you the time, to explain the difference between religion and ideology, to begin with, in Judaism, Zionism. And secondly, remind them that quite a lot of Jews are not Zionists and quite a lot of non-Jews are Zionists. So Zionism is not about Judaism. It's about a certain Christian and Jewish, but also Christian ideology that believes that a Jewish state in Palestine is a religious imperative. And I think it's easier today for people to, because of the books people like myself and others have written, I hope it's easier for people to say, wait a minute, if I'm against Zionism, it means I'm against racism. It means I'm against colonialism. It means I'm against settler colonialism. It means I'm against apartheid. So I think there's a way of dealing with this accusation if you know your history and you feel confident in your moral position about human attitudes such as racism. Yeah, I think it's possible, and I think it's not working as well as it used to for the Israelis. That's why they moved to Holocaust denial now. It's, if you're criticizing Israel, you're not just an anti-Semite. You're denying the Holocaust. God knows what's the connection, but they found the connection. Yes.
In the end, I want to ask you the questions of Irene Ventura that ask, I personally think that Israel and what it has become is the result of that unresolved psychic monster that was raised, culminating in the Holocaust experienced by the Jews, who, in my opinion, were simply moved to Palestine by the Europeans to get rid of them. So a trauma has created chronic traumatized people who can only repeat what they have experienced. Gabor Mate also talks about it. My question is, what Pape thinks about it, and if, in his opinion, the Israelis realize this, and how much faith in this could transform the conscience of people, their vision of themselves and what they are doing? Or is Israeli society now totally out of control?
First of all, I think it's the analysis is good, namely this whole European projection of the problem of anti-Semitism by moving it to Palestine. Namely, Europe doesn't have a closure with its anti-Jewish attitudes, but Zionism allowed it to have a closure, which is not good because this racism now in Europe is has transformed towards other people. So if you have a virus called racism in you, it remains even if the people targeted are different. It's still a race. Europe is still a very racist culture. And yes, I think the traumatization, as Gabor Mate puts it, is playing a role. I don't believe always in one-dimensional explanation. So I think it's one additional layer of the problems. Now, the most important question he asks, and which is right, are the Israelis aware of it? And the answer is not. No. There's totally ignorance in Israel about it, whether it's intentional ignorance or unconscious, subconscious ignorance. It doesn't matter. There's no realization of this. There's no realization of the manipulation of the Holocaust memory and how it is played in order to justify policies against the Palestinians. Yes, I think right now in a moment of history we are in, there's very little hope for change from within Israel. That's most important. For us, all of us, this is the bottom line is more important here. The bottom line is you cannot expect a change from within Israel. If Israel is not going to be stopped either by the international community or by the region, it will continue the project of settler colonialism, which will be translated to ethnic cleansing, continued ethnic cleansing of Palestinians until they feel that they have completed the job. And of course, this will not go without any reaction. And reaction here means a lot of violence. So yeah, unfortunately, it's too late to expect a change within Israel. The change can come after you stop Israel, not before.
The last question is from Alessandra Giuliano. She wrote, your book seems to me full of data and honest academic work. It seems to me that at the mainstream level, however, they are capable of totally ignoring this data, not of refusing the reading of it, but of ignoring it completely. How is it possible? What reading do you give to this huge discrepancy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You hear in Italy, for instance, very intelligent, educated people talk nonsense when it comes to Israel and Palestine. You talk to journalists that know the world, know life, and when it comes to Israel and Palestine, you hear the most infantile analysis, and especially in Germany, Italy, and France. I think it's a bit better in Britain and Scandinavia. But it's a very good question. How educated, learned, experienced people who produce knowledge uh, can not see the truth when it comes to Palestine. When it, when it hits you in the face, it's not as if you need Michel Foucault to understand what goes on there. I think, and that's why my last book, which I hope will be translated to Italian as well, lobbying for Zionism across the Atlantic, on both sides of the Atlantic. I think there is a very important lobby that uses academia, films, media to create this kind of shield that shields people from the facts. But this is not enough. The Orientalism, Islamophobia, or what the whole attitude to the rest of the world in the West. I think all of that creates a certain narrative that it's not easy to challenge it with facts, and so it means it will not be enough to produce the facts. We will need to do some more work with people to be more proactive in challenging the myth. You can do it with facts, but that's not enough. I suppose you need engagement with people because you're fighting a huge project of propaganda and fabrication that has been very successful for 100 years. So it won't be easy to unpack it, kind of, dissolve it.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Great.